Joining us, MS Now Justice and Intelligence reporter Ken Dilanian, MS Now senior national security reporter David Rohde, and former general counsel of the National Security Agency, Glenn Gerstell. We now have that sound. This is our friends at Meet the Press Daily, who went to a gas station in Pennsylvania to ask folks about the war and the rising costs. They encountered this woman who, as she will tell you, voted for Donald Trump 3 times.
If you could say something to President Trump and he was going to hear you right now, what would it be?
You're a worthless pile of
And you voted for him how many times?
3 times. That was my bad. Apparently, I'm an idiot.
That is the most striking interview I've seen about this war and about the consequences of it and the reaction to it from voters that support Donald Trump. And her anger, I mean, she's at a gas pump. Gas is now 30% more than it was. In some places, it's more than $6, $7, $8. That is a lot of money, and it's a big thing to swallow when the President of the United States is not making a coherent case for what we are there to do and how long we expect to be there.
It's both the case about what we're there to do, but also how was this planned and carried out? The possibility of Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, that's what's driving up the gas prices that made that woman so angry at the president, has been predicted for decades. And you saw over and over in this hearing, these officials were asked, Tulsi Gabbard, did you warn the president that the Iranians will close this strait and gas prices will go up? She declines to answer it. One of the generals was asked, is air power alone enough to achieve the president's goals? One of them, which Ratcliffe didn't mention, is somehow ending Iran's ability forever to have a nuclear weapon. That would require ground troops to go in and seize Iran's uranium. So over and over again, you had these members of his cabinet struggling to answer the claims he had made and these sort of broad promises he had made, and struggling to explain why this wasn't planned out better. Why did this attack happen so quickly with so little preparation in terms of gas prices?
Glenn?
Exactly right. I mean, you've seen how these hearings have become so politicized, so partisan. And it goes back to 2019. You know, we've had these annual threat hearings in Congress since 2006, right after the Office of the Director of National Intelligence was set up. We've had them every year. And in 2019, they became very political. That was, of course, the year with impeachments. And that was the year in which the intelligence community chiefs said something that Trump didn't want to hear, that Iran was not in danger of building a bomb imminently, that North Korea probably wouldn't give up its weapons in a negotiation. That's not what Trump wanted to hear then. He even said his intelligence chief, his own intelligence chief, should, quote, go back to school, you may recall. So here we are now, years later, back in the second Trump administration. We see the same dynamic at play where his own intelligence chiefs are taking pains to make sure they don't publicly undercut him in this area. And one really clear example of that was in Senator John Ossoff's question, the senator from Georgia at the end. He specifically said, well, where exactly is the imminent threat? Where is the imminent threat? And he kept asking Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, to say what was the imminent threat. And she danced around the question because obviously the intelligence community has not come up with an assessment that wasn't an imminent threat. She didn't want to say that. And she said, well, it's up to the president to decide. We'll talk more about it in the classified hearings, et cetera.
If there was an imminent threat, would there be intelligence that this administration could share with the American public safely?
Hard to say exactly about the specifics, but you'd certainly would expect, and based on my own experience in the intelligence community, there are ways of getting across the fundamental truth of the intelligence without revealing the sources and methods of the intelligence, which is, of course, what they want to keep hidden. And cloaking it all under the heading of this classified is a little too much. I think there would probably be ways that, just as we've seen in other times in the Ukraine war and elsewhere, where the United States wants to declassify some intelligence to let out some but not all of the details, that it would be possible to do that.
David?
And there was one development yesterday that builds on reporting MS Now had earlier. Iran offered to give away all of its enriched uranium during the peace talks. And hours later, the U.S. started dropping bombs. And The Guardian broke yesterday that there were British officials, the British National Security Advisor was present in Geneva during that last round of talks. The British were surprised by the Iranian offer. They thought it was credible. They thought the talks should continue. And the British were shocked when the Trump administration started bombing Iran hours later.
There is no question, an open question, Ken, of what exactly the president was shown in terms of intelligence. And one of the exchanges tried to get to that today in the Worldwide Threats hearing. This was with Tulsi Gabbard. Explain the origin of this question and what she said.
Well, they were trying to get at the question of whether she briefed the president or anyone briefed the president on the potential that Iran would retaliate against regional allies, for example, and she wouldn't answer the question. But in terms of this question about imminent threats and what the intelligence community assessed, as Glenn well knows, they put out an unclassified threat assessment paper every time they have one of these hearings. And today's edition was a 36-page document, and it listed border threats and transnational criminal groups as the top threat facing the United States. And you had to really look hard to find any mention of Iran in there. I mean, and this document usually takes months to prepare, so it was prepared a while ago. But nonetheless, it gives you a sense of where the intelligence community is on this question of where does Iran rank in the threats to the United States. And then there was another interesting episode during the hearing where in her prepared remarks, Tulsi Gabbard said, or was going to say, that the attack in July essentially decimated Iran's ability to enrich uranium. But she didn't say that when she was delivering those remarks. She omitted that paragraph and said something different instead, which was that after those attacks, Iran was trying to reconstitute its enrichment capability and was keeping out international inspectors. And Mark Warner called her on that, and she said, well, I skipped some paragraphs because I was running out of time, but she didn't mention that she had substituted that additional language in. So it suggested she was trying to shade her answers to conform with what the president wants as he carries out this war of choice against Iran, Katie.
Yeah, which is wild. Just let's put a point on that. That is a wild thing to have come out of this. Let me just go back to the Strait of Hormuz and what was expected, what the president was shown, what was expected about Iran's reaction, the retaliation. Let me play this exchange with Senator Mark Kelly and DNI Gabbard.
Yes or no, starting with, were you asked, I'm not asking if you did brief this, were you asked to brief on whether Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz?
I'm not going to comment on what the president did or didn't ask me on any topic.
I'm not asking if you briefed it. I'm just asking if there was a request
I understand.
by the White House. Director Ratcliffe, were you asked to brief on whether Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz?
The briefings to the president and the White House typically don't come at the request of the White House. So typically when we get intelligence that we want the president to be aware of, the intelligence community brings that to the president.
Did you produce the analysis for the Straits of Hormuz?
There has been and continues to be analysis with respect to that.
Were you asked to brief on how our adversaries and allies would respond to the war in Iran? I imagine I'll get the same answer. So it's just to point out here, it's challenging to forget about actually what was in the brief for a second. We're having a hard time finding out not only if you briefed the president on something, but even if the White House asked if they could be briefed on something or if analysis was produced.
So this is getting to the point of they should have expected the Strait to be shut or to be hampered by Iran. This was a move that they should have seen coming. And it's part of why that woman at the gas pump is so angry. Donald Trump can say all day long that we have enough oil in this country to supply Americans. We do, but the price of oil is not domestic. It is global. So when the price of oil goes up, it's over $100 a barrel. It's going to go up for everybody, including Americans, even if he is releasing from the strategic oil reserve. And I think that's what makes that exchange so fascinating, because there are open questions about whether the administration was even interested in that as a possibility.
And I talked to maritime experts. There's ways to prepare for this. And what normally would have happened, there's a buildup. The American way of war was one person put it to me, but you consult with allies. NATO countries have a ton of minesweepers. That's actually a strength they have. But because this happened so quickly, there was no effort to get enough ships into the region to take care of this obvious threat.
Or to even get NATO on our side?
Yes.
They weren't even alerted that this was coming.
Yes, and then you have the back and forth now where he's, calling out and attacking the British Prime Minister. But for months, the Europeans were alienated and Canada, because we're going to make Canada a state, we're going to seize Greenland, and we back off helping Ukraine. So all of this was predictable in terms of, for decades, there's been a warning about the Strait of Hormuz. We just don't have enough destroyers right now and other small ships to escort these tankers through the Strait of Hormuz. It's dangerous, but it's doable. You have drones fly overhead and Navy ships escort, and there's just no excuse for it. Again, the United States spends $800 billion a year on its military. That is more than every nation on earth combined. We have the money to do this. We just needed the planning to execute it.
And this would be, under any circumstances, even with lots of planning, an extremely difficult task. The straits are 21 miles wide, sort of about the length of Manhattan and a half or so it's not that big. The actual shipping channels in them are only the width of Manhattan. They're about 2 miles wide.
Yeah, because that's only the part where it's deepest for those ships to go
exactly.
through.
And so making sure that just a speedboat, a tiny little speedboat with someone armed with a shoulder missile, shoulder launched missile, is really difficult. So in order to completely eliminate the threat, you're talking about a very, very substantial
It
military
seemed like
operation.
Donald Trump was